Chapter 1. The Bell That Tolled Too Many Times. It was on an unforgiving March morning, when the fog lay over London like a woolen shroud and the chimneys wept soot, that the case of the 13th bell first rang in our ears, quite literally. We were seated before the fire at 221B Baker Street, Holmes with his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, and I buried in the Times, which was unusually full of church scandals and the latest disturbances in the colonies. Outside, the gloom clung to the windows as though determined to infiltrate even the warmest hearth. "You may put the paper down, Watson," Holmes said suddenly, without looking up. "There will be a knock at the door within the next 11 seconds, and we shall have more pressing matters than the Bishop of Bath's budget crisis." I had long ceased to question these pronouncements, and true to prediction, a brisk, anxious knock followed within the stated time frame. Mrs. Hudson entered, ushering in a tall, fair-haired man whose clerical collar and pinched expression identified him immediately as a man of the cloth. "I do apologize for the early call," he began breathlessly, "but I was told you are the man one comes to when the police find themselves confounded." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Indeed, Reverend, you are among friends. Please sit." The man did so, removing his gloves with nervous fingers. "I am the Reverend Julius Pembroke, vicar of St. Margaret's in Chesterton-on-Wye. I've travelled overnight and come directly from Paddington Station." "Then you are either desperate," Holmes observed, "or a man with a strong constitution. Possibly both." Reverend Pembroke managed a wan smile. "I confess, Mr. Holmes, I am at my wit's end. A murder has occurred in our village, in the bell tower of our ancient church, no less, and under circumstances so peculiar that I scarcely know how to recount them." Holmes leaned forward, a gleam kindling in his grey eyes. "Pray begin." The Reverend took a steadying breath. "It happened 2 days ago, on the eve of our Lenten preparations. As tradition dictates, our bell ringers assemble each evening in the week before Lent for practice. We have a fine peal of 12 bells, cast in 1743 and still rung in sequence during major church festivals." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "That night, the village was startled by the ringing of a 13th bell. I started. 'Surely you mean a miscount.' 'No, Doctor. The villagers know the pattern well. They counted 12 chimes, then, several seconds later, a 13th, sharp, isolated." Holmes's brows arched in interest. "And who heard this?" "Half the village, I would say. It was nearly 8 o'clock. The streets were still busy, and many were preparing for the Shrove Tuesday service." Holmes steepled his fingers once more. "Go on." "The bell tower, as you might expect, was promptly investigated. Inside, the bell ringers, 4 of them, were found in states of confusion and fear, and worse still, the choirmaster, Mr. Edwin Layton, was discovered lying dead at the foot of the spiral stairs, his neck broken." "An accident?" I offered. Pembroke shook his head firmly. "That's just it, Doctor. There was no sign of a fall. He was not found beneath the bell ropes, nor near the upper tower. He was crumpled on the lowest landing as if he had been dropped, or rather placed there." Holmes rose and walked slowly to the hearth, his gaze distant. "Did anyone witness Mr. Layton enter the bell tower?" He was seen entering the church at 7:45. He had no reason to ascend the tower. He wasn't one of the bell ringers. In fact, forgive me, this is difficult. He had argued with them only days before, threatening to disband the ringing society for reasons I still don't fully understand. Disband? I asked. Why? There had been a dispute over an irregular ringing. Bells rung at midnight without authorization. Leighton accused them of misusing the tower for pagan mischief, but no one confessed. Holmes turned, his face keen with curiosity. And the 13th bell? There is no such bell at St. Margaret's? None, Pembroke confirmed. Only 12. And yet the sound was distinctly that of our own tower. Several people even claimed it sounded deeper, older, a phantom bell, Holmes murmured. Pembroke grimaced. So the local paper called it. The Chesterton Gazette ran the headline, "Murder by the 13th Bell." Now the village is beside itself, half gripped with superstition, the other half suspecting the church itself of covering something up. Holmes resumed his seat, his fingers drumming once against the armrest. Who discovered the body? One of the bell ringers, a boy named Thomas Huggins. He'd gone to fetch a dropped glove from the stairwell. Did he touch the body? No, Mr. Holmes. He ran to fetch the verger immediately. Were there any marks on the body? Bruises, blood? A slight bruise on the temple, but the doctor ruled the cause of death as a broken neck. No external wounds. Holmes closed his eyes briefly. And the bells? You said they were rung? Yes. The full 12 at 7:55. All the ringers were accounted for. It's the solitary 13th chime, at precisely 8:02, that no one will claim responsibility for. Holmes smiled faintly. And the police? What does Scotland Yard make of it? Pembroke shifted uncomfortably. They sent a man, Inspector Baines, I believe, but he left after a day, muttering about village hysteria. Called it a tragic fall, nothing more. Holmes opened his eyes, sharp and alert once more. You are right to come to me, Reverend. There is something deliciously contradictory about a crime that presents too many impossibilities. He rose briskly. Watson, we leave for Chesterton-on-Wye at first light. I blinked. Indeed? Indeed, for there are few things more compelling than a murder timed to a bell that doesn't exist. Chapter 2. The Journey to Chesterton. The following morning dawned with little improvement in the weather. A persistent drizzle followed us from London to the rural reaches of Gloucestershire, where the village of Chesterton-on-Wye nestled among low hills and thick hedgerows, like a secret one might hesitate to reveal. Holmes was in excellent spirits. The train rattled along through the grey countryside. He sat across from me in our compartment, tapping his fingers lightly against the window frame, his gaze far away and yet unmistakably alert. You find this case invigorating, I remarked, setting aside the paper, even though the details remain, to my mind, frustratingly sparse. Holmes smiled thinly. Sparser cases, my dear Watson, often yield the richest deductions. Complexity, after all, is rarely in the crime itself, but in the assumptions it hides behind. I frowned. You believe the bell, this so-called 13th chime, was a deliberate deception. I believe, Holmes said, that no ghostly bell tolled in St. Margaret's Tower. Bells do not ring themselves, Watson, and no phantasm has yet managed to snap a man's neck with such tidy finality. He paused, then added with a glint in his eye, "Besides, have you ever known a ghost to bother with punctuality?" Despite myself, I chuckled. Holmes leaned back. "The true question is not how the bell rang, nor even who caused it to. It is, why ring it at precisely that moment? What was the purpose? In theatrical crimes, Watson, timing is never coincidental. It is, more often than not, the linchpin." We sat in silence for a few miles, the train chugging past misty fields and sleeping orchards. Finally, I spoke. "And Mr. Layton, the choir master, you accept it as murder?" Holmes's expression hardened slightly. His death bears the hallmarks of arrangement. The placement of the body, the absence of immediate trauma, the coinciding distraction of the bell. No, Watson, accidents do not dress themselves with such dramatic trappings. Someone staged a scene. Now we must ask, what did they wish the village to believe, and what did they hope to conceal? Chesterton-on-Wye was a picturesque place, the sort of village that might grace the cover of a railway guide. Rows of mossy stone cottages, narrow lanes curved like question marks, and at its centre the looming silhouette of St. Margaret's Church. As we disembarked at the modest station, we found Reverend Pembroke waiting beside a horse-drawn carriage, his face tense with restrained anxiety. "I am grateful you've come," he said, shaking Holmes's hand. "It has only grown worse since I left. The villagers whisper of curses, the bell-ringers won't return to the tower, and Edwin's widow has received a letter suggesting he was involved in occult practices." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "The usual tremors that follow an unsteady foundation. Let us see if we may reinforce it with truth." We rode in silence through the muddy village lanes. A few curious faces peered through windows as we passed, though no one waved. There was something in the atmosphere, too subdued for gossip, too tense for mere grief. I could feel it in the way Pembroke's hands twitched at the reins, in the wary glances exchanged at the corner shop. The village, it seemed, was holding its breath. St. Margaret's Church came into view slowly as we rounded the village green. It was an imposing building, older than most in the parish, its stonework weathered to a soft ash grey. A square tower rose at its western end, topped by a brooding weather vane in the shape of a trumpet-blowing angel. As we stepped from the carriage, Holmes tilted his head to listen. "No bells today?" "No," he asked. Pembroke shook his head. "I've suspended them. The tower is avoided now. Even our verger refuses to ascend it." Holmes nodded once. "Good. Then it has been left undisturbed. We shall visit it shortly." We entered through the nave. Inside, the church was colder than the outside air. The stained-glass windows cast watery colours upon the flagstones, and the thick silence was broken only by the occasional creak of timber. Pembroke led us to the vestry, where tea had been set out. He began to recount in greater detail the circumstances surrounding Layton's death, his entry into the church, the timing of the bell practice, the moment of the 13th chime, and the discovery of the body. I listened attentively, making notes. Holmes said little, pacing slowly around the room, his eyes moving across the walls, the floor, the scuffed corners of the old furniture. Who else had access to the tower that evening? Holmes asked. Pembroke sighed. Besides the 4 bell-ringers? Only Layton, perhaps. Or the verger, Mr. Alcott. But he was preparing candles in the apse at the time. And the bell ringers themselves, what can you tell me of them?" Pembroke retrieved a folded sheet of names from his pocket. William Crouch, the leader, a stern man in his 50s. His niece, Anna Crouch, aged 20. James Foley, a farmhand. And Thomas Huggins, the youngest, barely 16. Holmes murmured, "Interesting. 2 men, 1 boy, and 1 young woman, and none of them saw or heard anything amiss? They insist not, only that the final ring, a chime they all deny pulling, sounded wrong, as though it came from above, but with a tone none of them recognized." Holmes folded his arms. "Even the familiar, when cleverly altered, can be rendered uncanny. I have seen such tricks with lighting in the theatre. Why not with sound?" He turned to me. "Watson, would you care to inspect a bell tower under a shroud of suspicion?" I stood, setting aside my teacup. "With pleasure." Pembroke led us to the base of the tower. The heavy oak door groaned on its hinges as we stepped inside. The air was musty with damp stone and old rope. A narrow spiral staircase twisted upward into the gloom. Holmes examined the first few steps carefully, his gaze sweeping over the banister, the dust, the scuff marks. He paused midway. "Here," he said, pointing to a faint mark on the stone. Something was dragged, heavy, not for long, possibly a body repositioned. He looked up into the darkness above us. "Come, Watson, let us meet the bells." We ascended. The belfry chamber was circular, open to the winter air through louvred windows. The great bronze bells loomed above us in a frame of timbers blackened by centuries. 12 of them. Holmes moved through them silently, counting, observing. Then he stopped. "One of these bells," he said slowly, "has not been rung in decades." He pointed to the third from the left. "There. That patina is different, and the rope is older, less worn." Pembroke looked startled. "That bell?" "Yes, it cracked long ago. We never use it. It's tuned differently, deeper." Holmes turned, his expression unreadable. "And yet," he said softly, "the village heard it chime." Chapter 3. The Scene of Deception. Holmes remained still beneath the cracked bell, his gloved hand resting lightly on the dust-flecked wooden support frame. The ropes above swung gently in the breeze, creaking faintly, an uneasy sound like an old house shifting in its sleep. I stood a few paces behind him, notebook in hand, as the Reverend Pembroke hovered near the stairwell with an expression of unease. "This bell," Holmes said at last, tapping the disused one gently with his knuckle, "is the only one whose tone would not match the others. Its crack would distort the resonance, and yet, if I were a layman listening from the village green, the chime would register simply as other." "You believe this was the bell rung as the so-called 13th? I asked. Holmes nodded once, and not by accident. "Consider, Watson, why activate the one bell known to be faulty, long since retired, and only after the standard 12 had rung?" "Symbolism?" Pembroke offered nervously. "A deliberate 13th, unholy, to frighten." "Perhaps," Holmes said, "but symbolism does not require a corpse. Let us assume instead that the bell was not rung for its meaning, but for its function. It was meant to mask a sound, or distract from one." He turned on his heel and began to pace the belfry floor, his eyes scanning the planks the coiled ropes, the nearby window louvres. I followed, peering over the edge of the trapdoor opening that led down into the tower. A cold draught rose from the stairwell, carrying the faint scent of ancient stone and wet wool. I imagined the victim, Mr. Layton, lying crumpled on the first landing below, as if dropped from above. But no blood, no broken banister, nothing, as yet, to suggest how he had come to such an unnatural end. Holmes crouched suddenly near a coil of rope by the west-facing window. "Watson," he said quietly, "observe." I knelt beside him. The floorboards here bore two faint parallel grooves, each perhaps a yard in length, running toward the trapdoor. Between them, a subtle discoloration. Dust disturbed, then resettled. "Drag marks," I murmured. Holmes nodded. A chest, perhaps, or a large object, something heavy moved hastily. "And here, look, fibres." He extracted a few short brown threads from the floor, holding them up to the light. Rough wool. Not from the bell ropes, but perhaps from a Hydra's cloak, or from a sack. What would such an object be doing in the bell tower? I don't know yet, but I intend to find out. He rose, brushing off his knees. "Tell me, Reverend, has anything been reported missing from the church since the murder?" Pembroke shook his head slowly. "No, not to my knowledge. Though, to be truthful, I've barely slept since returning." "Then I should like to examine the storeroom." We descended the spiral stairs slowly, Holmes noting each creak, each scuff upon the stone. At the base, he paused for a long moment at the landing where Layton had been found. "The boy, Thomas Huggins, found him here?" Holmes asked. "Yes," Pembroke replied, his voice subdued. "He said he was coming back for his glove and nearly tripped over the body." Holmes crouched again, tracing the wall with his fingers. "There is a curvature here. See this niche, hidden from above by the stair itself." He stood and faced us. If someone had wanted to leave the body in haste, somewhere it would be found quickly but not immediately. It's a clever choice, just out of the bell ringer's line of sight. We moved to the rear of the church where the storeroom lay, tucked between the vestry and the side aisle. Holmes opened the door and stepped inside. It was a small, dusty chamber crammed with old hymnals, brass candle holders, and wooden stands. Holmes moved with care, opening cupboards, lifting tarps. He paused at a small table covered in a moth-eaten cloth. Upon it sat an oil lantern, a pair of leather gloves, and, oddly, a glass jar filled with metal filings. Holmes held the jar up to the light. "Powdered iron," he said, "used sometimes for tuning or weight adjustment in the bell hammers, or," he trailed off, "or for something far more calculated." He knelt and reached under the table. "Ah," he said. He withdrew a square wooden box. Within it, nestled in straw, was a compact, well-used handbell, a portable chime with a brass handle, its tongue rusted and darkened by time. Pembroke stepped forward in confusion. "But that's not from the tower, that's a practice bell," Holmes confirmed, "but large enough, when struck near, a microphone or an old tube amplifier, to imitate something far grander." I blinked. "You believe the 13th bell was fabricated? I believe, Watson, that sound, like light, can deceive." Holmes examined the straw within the box. It's recently disturbed. See how uneven the bedding is? Someone returned this in haste. And here, scratches along the rim. It was struck recently." Pembroke paled. "You think someone used this bell to imitate a chime? Perhaps not imitate, but certainly mislead." Holmes stood, his eyes burning with thought. Suppose someone needed the village to hear a bell chime at a precise time, after the standard 12, when it would most stand out. A bell not rung by the ropes, not even from the tower, just loud enough, timed carefully enough to suggest a 13th had sounded. He turned to Pembroke. Was anyone standing in the nave at 8:02 that night? The vicar thought for a moment. Yes, Mrs. Glenworth, an older woman. She said she heard the bell echo faintly through the west window. Holmes nodded slowly. Then the bell didn't ring above, it rang below. We returned to the nave, where Holmes paced in careful silence, his footsteps echoing off the stone. He stopped beneath the organ loft, where the wooden floorboards above formed a low canopy over the back pews. He reached up, fingers probing along the beam, and withdrew them holding a thin, frayed wire. "Someone strung a trigger here," he said, "to strike a bell below or behind the curtain." Pembroke's face drained of colour. Then it was all a ruse. Holmes's eyes were unreadable. Someone planned it all with precision. The 13th bell. The shock. The discovery of the body. A drama played out for the village. He turned to us both. And the question is, for whose benefit was the performance staged? Chapter 4. A circle of secrets attended to the vicarage, just past midday, where a modest luncheon awaited us in the study. Thick slices of bread, cold ham and tea served with local honey. Holmes, ever disinterested in food when a case had truly seized his mind, took only a sip of tea before setting his cup aside. "I should like to speak to the bell ringers," he said abruptly. Reverend Pembroke glanced up from buttering a scone. "Separately, I assume." Holmes gave a brief nod. Individually, and without forewarning. No script rehearsed, no glances exchanged. Lies prefer company, you'll find. By 1:30, arrangements had been made. Pembroke summoned each ringer under the pretext of a meeting about the upcoming Advent service. They arrived one at a time, each unaware of the other's summons, and were shown into the study, where Holmes and I waited. William Crouch first came, William Crouch, the senior ringer. A man of thick wrists and deliberate movements, with the sort of frown that appeared to have been permanently carved into his brow. Holmes studied him silently for a long moment. "You led the ringing sequence on the night in question," he said at last. "I did," Crouch replied, voice gravelly, "as I've done for over 20 years. Had Mr. Leighton ever joined you before?" Crouch shook his head. "He'd no business in the tower. Didn't like us much, truth be told. Thought ringing was a distraction from choir rehearsals. And the 13th bell? I heard it," Crouch said slowly. "But I didn't pull it. None of us did. The sequence had ended. Did you see Leighton that evening?" "No. I saw his coat hanging in the back pew. Figured he'd stayed below." Holmes regarded him. "You're a methodical man, Mr. Crouch. I imagine you keep close watch on your team." "I don't abide nonsense," Crouch replied flatly. "Not in the tower." Holmes let the silence stretch before speaking again. "'Tis You were to guess who among you might do something out of order. Disrupt a performance, say. Who would it be? Crouch considered. James Foley. He's young, full of himself. Quick hands, quick a temper. Holmes thanked him and dismissed him. Anna Crouch next came Anna, William's niece, a serious young woman of perhaps 20, with steady eyes and a reserved manner. Miss Crouch, Holmes said, you are the only woman in the ringing team. That cannot be easy. Anna shrugged. Uncle doesn't coddle. I pull my weight. Did you notice anything odd on the night of the murder? She hesitated. Only that Thomas was jumpier than usual. He kept checking the stairwell like he expected someone to come up behind him. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Did you say anything to him? No, he'd deny it anyway. Do you believe someone rang the 13th bell? I know someone did, Anna replied, her voice flat. But it wasn't us. Who then? I've no proof. But Leighton made enemies. His sermons were polite, but his gossip was cruel. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Gossip? Anna nodded. He was fond of hints, wouldn't name names, but he'd say just enough to turn people against one another. And did he speak of you? I expect so. I'm unmarried and live with my uncle. That's enough to start tongues wagging. Holmes nodded slowly. You're dismissed, Miss Crouch. Thank you. Shh. James Foley arrived with his shirt unbuttoned at the collar and the scent of tobacco clinging to his jacket. He was a wiry lad of perhaps 22, with a loose grin that did little to conceal the sharpness in his gaze. Mr. Foley, Holmes said, you've been implicated as something of a disruptive force. Foley chuckled. That sounds like Crouch talking. Perhaps. Tell me, do you resent authority? Only when it's misused. Did Mr. Leighton misuse it? Foley's jaw clenched. He threatened to have me barred from the tower. Said I'd been drinking before practice. Had you? Foley shrugged. I wasn't drunk, and I rang better than half the others. He just didn't like me. Holmes studied him for a long moment. Where were you when the 13th bell rang? Right where I was meant to be, holding the Sally on bell 6. And after? I heard it, like everyone, but I didn't see anything. Holmes dismissed him with a glance. As Foley left, I turned to my companion. He has the attitude. Holmes, but not the mind. Holmes nodded faintly. An impatient hand, yes, but not the fingers of a puppeteer. Thomas Huggins. The last to arrive was Thomas Huggins, a freckled, anxious youth whose collar sat too high for his neck. He fidgeted with his cap as he sat, twisting it between his fingers. You found the body, Mr. Huggins, Holmes began softly. Yes, sir. You returned for your glove. Yes, sir. I dropped it near the bottom of the stairs. Holmes leaned forward. And when you saw Mr. Leighton, what did you feel? Thomas swallowed. I felt sick. He didn't look natural. His eyes. You were afraid. Yes. Holmes paused. Did you see anyone else? Anyone descending? The stairs ahead of you? Thomas's lips parted, then closed. No, sir. Holmes narrowed his eyes slightly. Are you certain? Thomas looked down. I thought I heard something above. A scuff, but I didn't see anyone. Holmes let the silence hang. Tell me, Thomas, who do you trust the least in your team? The boy's hands tightened on his cap. I don't want to say. But you must. Thomas stared at the floor. Anna. She's nice, but she lied about where she was during practice. How so? She said she didn't leave the chamber, but I saw her descend halfway down the stairs at one point, just for a minute. Holmes's gaze gleamed. Thank you, Thomas. That will be all. When the door closed behind the boy, Holmes turned to me with a small, tight smile. Well, Watson, we have contradictions. Anna left the chamber, and Thomas did not tell anyone until now. He stood and walked to the window, gazing out toward the church tower silhouetted in the fading light. Crouch keeps order, but order can mask control. Foley bears a grudge, but he lacks finesse. Anna perhaps cleverer than she appears, and Thomas fearful but observant. He turned back to me. Did you notice, Watson, that no one mentioned Edwin Layton's widow? I hadn't thought of her exactly, and yet she too heard the 13th bell. Holmes's smile faded. This case is not about bells, Watson. It is about timing, perception, and the careful crafting of illusion. He turned back to the window. And fear, the illusion is not yet complete. Chapter 5. The Sound of Guilt. The following morning dawned with a brittle coldness that stiffened the joints and caused breath to hang in the air like smoke. Holmes and I took a modest breakfast at the vicarage before making our way to the Green Dragon, Chesterton's solitary public house and a wellspring of village murmurs. Rumours, as ever, had begun to congeal around a name. Foley, Reverend Pembroke confided as we walked through the square. There's talk among the farmers that James Foley was seen lingering behind the church after the ringing, that he was drunk or looking for trouble. Holmes raised a brow. Interesting, he said mildly. Guilt rarely makes so public an appearance. We found Foley already seated near the hearth of the inn, a pint untouched before him, and a sour look on his face. The innkeeper, a red-faced man named Briggs, was polishing glasses behind the counter, but watched Foley with the wary eye one gives to a fox near the hen-house. Mr. Foley, Holmes greeted, sliding into the bench opposite. You've made yourself a popular suspect. Foley scowled. Let them talk. They'll blame the first man with untidy boots and a strong opinion. Holmes smiled faintly. And do you often linger behind the church after hours? Foley looked away. I've done it, yes, but not that night. I left after the practice, walked straight home. My landlord saw me. Who is your landlord? Walter Cribb. He keeps to himself, but he's no liar. Holmes nodded slowly. You and Layton did not get along. Foley's jaw clenched. He wanted me out, thought I was unfit, said I brought disrepute to the church. Did you? No, more than anyone else, he said bitterly. Layton just hated being challenged. He played the choir like a game of chess, moving people, dropping them, whispering into ears. Holmes leaned forward. And what, Mr. Foley, if I told you that the 13th bell was likely rung not by a rope, but from within the church itself, perhaps using a handbell and a mechanical trigger? Foley blinked, his anger shifting toward confusion. Then I'd say you've found a clever liar, Mr. Holmes. But it isn't me, Briggs snorted from the bar. He was always looking for fights with Layton. Foley rounded on him. And you've always resented I never bought your warm beer. Briggs raised his hands in mock surrender, but the damage was done. A few other villagers, seated at tables nearby, had turned their heads just enough to eavesdrop with plausible deniability. Holmes observed it all quietly. When we left the inn a few minutes later, Foley's shoulders were hunched with resentment, his reputation bending beneath the weight of village consensus. I turned to Holmes as we stepped back into the cold. "You don't believe it's him?" Holmes shook his head. "He is angry, yes, but anger without calculation is rarely dangerous. And Foley is no architect of elaborate theatre. He couldn't have devised the bell trick. Someone else did. Someone with access, subtlety, and patience." "Then who?" Holmes glanced sideways at me. "That," he said, "is precisely what I intend to find out." Later that afternoon, we visited the widow. Mrs. Layton lived in a modest cottage behind the parish hall, where ivy curled like sleeping fingers over the window-sills, and the garden had been left to grow wild. She greeted us with a quiet dignity, her dark hair pulled into a simple bun, her black dress plain and without embellishment. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Holmes," she said, leading us into a parlour that smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. I must confess I wasn't certain if I wanted to speak of Edwin again, but if you can bring clarity to it— "I hope only to understand," Holmes replied, settling gently into the armchair she offered. "Did your husband speak often of the bell-ringers?" Her expression darkened. More than he should. He found them unruly, particularly young Foley. Edwin said he corrupted the order of things, but it wasn't just that. She hesitated, fingers gripping her handkerchief. There were letters, left unsigned, but clearly written by someone from the church. They accused Edwin of impropriety. My brows rose. Was there any truth to them? She stiffened. "None. But Edwin feared scandal, even the scent of it. He tried to track down the writer, but they were clever. No handwriting matched, and then, a week before his death, he said he'd figured it out, that he would expose them." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Did he name anyone?" She hesitated. "No, he only said the bell will ring for them next." I thought it was a metaphor. Holmes nodded slowly, his fingers drumming once against his knee. "May I see the letters?" She rose and returned a moment later with a small bundle tied in twine. Holmes examined the paper carefully. "They're typed," he said, "and the paper is from the church office." She blinked. "How can you tell?" "The watermark. St. Margaret's Parish. Linen blend. Used exclusively for correspondence. Your husband was correct. This was an inside job." He tucked the letters away gently. "Thank you, Mrs. Layton. You've been very brave." She looked down at her hands. "Find who did this." Edwin was not. A kind man, Mr. Holmes. But he didn't deserve that. Outside, I turned to Holmes, chilled by the sharp wind and the darker implications. "You believe someone in the church office wrote those letters?" "I do. And I believe they were more than spite. They were a warning. And when that failed to silence Layton, he was eliminated." "And the bell? A distraction, a flourish, theatrics to cover a final act." He stopped at the corner of the green, eyes narrowed against the wind. "We must speak to the verger, Mr. Alcott. Yes, he tends the church grounds. He knows who comes and goes, and who holds keys to what." We found Mr. Alcott in the churchyard, trimming ivy, with slow, steady strokes. He was an elderly man, bent with years, but still sharp of eye. Holmes greeted him respectfully. "Mr. Alcott, forgive the intrusion. Might we speak a moment about the church?" Alcott leaned on his shears. "I'll not argue with London men, but I've said all I know." Holmes smiled kindly. "Then let me ask you this. Who has keys to the parish office?" Alcott frowned. "Myself, the vicar, Miss Crouch, and until last month, Mr. Leighton." Holmes nodded. "And who has used the office most recently?" "Miss Crouch. She manages the rotors and keeps the bell logs." Holmes's eyes flickered. "And do you recall? Was she present the night of the murder?" Alcott wiped his hands on a cloth. "Came by early. Said she was collecting forms. Left before the ringing." Holmes thanked him and turned away, his face unreadable. I followed as he walked briskly back toward the vicarage. "Well?" I asked. "What does that tell us?" Holmes's voice was quiet but sharp. "That Miss Crouch had motive, access and opportunity, and perhaps a secret worth killing for." Chapter 6. The detail that didn't ring true by the following morning. The village of Chesterton-on-Wye had quieted somewhat, on the surface at least, but as Holmes and I made our way back towards St. Margaret's under a grey sky that threatened rain, I could sense in my companion a growing certainty that we had reached the edge of something. Not the solution, no. Holmes never pretended to. Divine answers from the ether, but rather a precipice, the sort of moment when the fog begins to lift and the shape beneath it becomes just discernible. "It is always the small things, Watson," he said as we passed the iron gate into the churchyard. "The overlooked, the dismissed, the grain of sand in the shoe that upends an entire journey. You've seen something." Holmes smiled faintly. "I have remembered something, or more precisely, I have noticed what I failed to remember." Inside the church, Reverend Pembroke greeted us with visible weariness. He had aged perceptibly in the past 3 days. Must confess, Mr. Holmes, I had not realized the full weight of this matter. There is fear now, quiet, but spreading. The bell tower has become a thing whispered about. The villagers no longer ask if something is wrong. They simply assume it. Holmes placed a hand on the vicar's shoulder. "Then let us remove the root of that fear." He turned to me. "Watson, let us revisit the scene. Alone this time." We ascended the bell tower once more. The cold seemed sharper here, amplified by stone and shadow. I followed Holmes as he moved not to the belfry this time, but to the middle landing, the site of Leighton's discovery. He crouched near the wall, just beneath the curve of the spiral. "Watson, recall what young Thomas told us, that he came back for a dropped glove. Yes, and that he nearly tripped over the body." "Correct." Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew a small folded paper, the initial police sketch, drawn crudely at the time of Leighton's discovery. Note the body's orientation. On its back, head facing west, left arm outstretched. Now consider. Thomas claims to have entered from above, having descended the stair. If the body lay here, in his path, why would he have nearly tripped? There is ample space on the landing. One would see the body plainly. I frowned, unless the light was dim. Holmes nodded. A possibility. But Reverend Pembroke stated the tower lantern was lit before the ringing commenced. Therefore, the landing would have been visible. He stood. "I submit that the body was not originally placed here, but higher, He turned toward the belfry stairs, and something or someone brought it down. Back in the nave, Holmes moved with a surgeon's focus. "I want to examine the bell log," he said abruptly. Reverend Pembroke fetched it from the vestry, a large leather-bound ledger filled with neat slanting script. Holmes flipped through the entries for the past month. "Here," he said, "the night of the murder. Bell practice was logged at precisely 7:45. 12 bells. Standard sequence." He tapped a line farther down, but no note regarding the 13th chime. "Would there be?" I asked. "If someone truly believed it was supernatural? Perhaps not. But here's what's odd, Watson. Every previous entry in this log is initialed by Anna Crouch." He pointed. "All but this one. The line was blank." "A small omission," I said. Holmes smiled. "And precisely for that reason, it interests me." He flipped the page again. Then he stopped. "Watson, look at this." He held the book at an angle, so the light struck it fully, just, faintly, almost imperceptibly, beneath the blank space on the page, the indentation of a rubbed-out word. Holmes retrieved a pencil and lightly shaded the area. As the lead passed over the indentations, a single word emerged. "Test." We stared at it. "A rehearsal," I murmured. "Someone ran a trial, practiced the bell trick before the murder." Holmes's expression darkened. "Yes, and they recorded it here, then erased it. Which means they used the church, and intended from the start to fabricate the 13th chime." Holmes turned sharply. "We must speak to Miss Crouch again." We found Anna in the church garden, tying bundles of rosemary and sage for the coming Sunday's altar display. She stood when we approached, wiping her hands on her apron. "Miss Crouch," Holmes said pleasantly, "I hoped you might help us clarify a few details." She nodded, her face calm but pale. Holmes held up the ledger. "Your handwriting is consistent throughout. You keep the bell logs, do you not?" "I do," she said evenly. "And you were present the evening of Mr. Leighton's death?" She nodded again. Holmes opened the book. "There's an erased entry here. Do you recognize it?" She leaned forward, then stiffened as the shaded word came into view. "Test," she read aloud, her voice flat. "You didn't mention a test in your initial interview." "There was no official test," she said quickly. Only a moment the day before. Uncle asked me to stay late and help him examine the ropes. He thought one was fraying. We struck a bell once or twice. Which bell? I don't remember." Holmes's eyes were steel. "Miss Crouch, the bell was number 3, the cracked one. The one not used in decades." She said nothing, "And the following night, your name is missing from the log. That has never occurred before." She looked away. Holmes's tone softened. "This isn't an accusation. But someone used this church, its history, its sounds, its rhythms, as part of a deception. Someone who knew where the ropes hung, who had keys, who could access the ledgers and edit them, who knew how to time a sound to mislead an entire village." Anna swallowed. "I didn't kill Mr. Leighton." "No," Holmes said quietly. "But you know who did." Tears welled in her eyes. She stopped. "I can't. I gave my word." "To whom?" But she said nothing more. Holmes stepped back, his face unreadable. "Then perhaps it is time," he said softly, "to speak to the only man in the tower who saw nothing, yet heard everything. Your uncle? No, Holmes said. Thomas. Huggins. Chapter 7. The Boy Who Heard Too Much. The fog returned that evening, draping the village of Chesterton-on-Wye in a veil of grey uncertainty. Chimneys smoked like slow, breathing beasts, and the glow from oil lamps shimmered in the mist like pale eyes watching from the dark. Holmes, never one to wait for answers to arrive politely, asked Reverend Pembroke to summon young Thomas Huggins to the vestry office under the pretence of a choral inquiry. The boy arrived looking nervous but composed, his cap held tightly in one hand, and a bruise on his forearm that Holmes noticed immediately. "You've hurt yourself," Holmes said casually, gesturing to the mark. Thomas looked down quickly. "Fell," he muttered, "on the green, running." Holmes offered no response, only motioned for him to sit. We had cleared the vestry of everyone else. Even Pembroke was asked to step out, which he did reluctantly. Holmes folded his hands. "Thomas, we've come to believe that someone used the cracked bell deliberately, likely as a form of distraction. But we're also interested in what happened just before it rang. You said you heard something above." The boy nodded hesitantly. A scuff, like boots on stone. "Were you the only one who heard it?" "I think so. Mr. Foley was too busy, shouting to hear anything, and Anna was staring at the ropes. And yet you did not mention it immediately. I didn't want to cause trouble." Holmes leaned forward, voice soft. "Did you see someone descend the stairs before you found the body?" Thomas looked away. "No," he said quickly. "I just saw Mr. Layton." Holmes did not speak for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and withdrew the small handbell we had recovered from the storeroom. He held it out in front of Thomas. "Have you seen this before?" Thomas's eyes flickered toward it and widened, not in recognition, but fear. I don't know what that is." Holmes's gaze remained level. "This bell was used that night. Not by you, I think, but by someone nearby. It would not be hard for someone to hide it beneath the stairs, or even in their coat." The boy bit his lip hard. "I didn't ring anything. I swear it." Holmes's voice dropped to a whisper. "But you know who did." Silence. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows with a hollow moan. "I can't," Thomas finally whispered. "He said I mustn't, that it was a joke, a trick, that no one was supposed to get hurt." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "Who, Thomas?" he asked gently. "Who made you promise?" The boy trembled. "Mr. Crouch." Holmes didn't flinch. "What did he tell you?" "That he was going to teach Mr. Layton a lesson. That the man needed to be embarrassed, not harmed. He said they'd ring an old bell just after the service, make it seem like a ghost, to frighten him." Thomas swallowed hard. "But it all went wrong." Holmes nodded slowly. "How?" Thomas shook his head. "I don't know. I just heard something fall. Then a scream. Then silence. A scream." The boy hesitated. "It was soft, like someone surprised. Not loud." Holmes leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. "You've done well, Thomas, but there's one more thing." He pulled a small paper envelope from his coat and handed it to the boy. Inside was a single, roughly torn corner of cloth. Thomas's eyes went wide. "That's mine," he said. "My scarf." I lost it." Holmes nodded. "It was found snagged behind the rear banister on a lower stairwell you would not have reached unless you'd gone farther down." The boy looked up, stricken. I followed Mr. Crouch." "Why?" "I didn't trust him. He was acting strange. He kept checking his watch, and he told Anna she should stay back and help him with something. But then he came down without her. So I crept behind." Holmes's voice was quiet but precise. "And what did you see?" Thomas's voice cracked. "I saw Mr. Leighton, already on the ground." Crouch was kneeling beside him. Then he heard me on the stairs, and he stood up, fast, and told me to go back up. Said he'd just found the body too. But I knew he was lying. Holmes sat still for several seconds. Then he stood. "Thank you, Thomas. You've told the truth. That's all I needed." Back in the vicarage study, Holmes paced silently, his hands behind his back. "You believe Crouch is the killer, then?" I asked, still absorbing the boy's revelation. "I believe he was involved," Holmes said, "but there is still a piece missing." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Holmes stopped, looking at the candle's flickering shadow across the logbook on the desk. "Consider Watson. Crouch staged the 13th bell to embarrass Leighton. But if Leighton was found with his neck broken, placed deliberately in a certain position, then it was no accident. Someone altered the plan." "You mean there was more than one hand at work?" "Exactly. A second actor, possibly unknown to Crouch, possibly manipulating the plan for their own ends." I leaned forward. "But who, Anna? She has secrets, yes, but I sense protection, not aggression. And then there's the widow. You think Mrs. Leighton could be involved?" Holmes turned. "She gave us those letters freely. But what if she suspected more than she said? What if she knew her husband was being blackmailed? Not just threatened with scandal, but genuinely silenced?" I stared at him. "You think the letters weren't simply warnings?" "I think," Holmes said slowly, "they were invitations. And someone accepted." That night, Holmes sat awake by the fire long after I had retired. When I awoke just before dawn, he was already at the window, watching the grey light stretch slowly over the rooftops. "We gather them all," he said as I entered. "Every suspect, every voice. For what?" He turned to me with that familiar glint, the one that preceded revelation, for the final performance. If this crime was staged like theatre, Watson, then it deserves its curtain call. Chapter 2. 8. The bell that wasn't meant to toll. The gathering took place in the vestry chamber of St. Margaret's Church the next evening, just after evensong. The tall candelabra cast a pale light upon the room, flickering softly across wooden chairs, arranged in a loose semicircle. Holmes had insisted upon this setup, claiming the circular arrangement allowed the eye to see what the tongue conceals. The air inside was thick with unspoken tension. Reverend Pembroke sat stiffly at one end, beside the nervous Mrs. Leighton. On her other side was Anna Crouch, who had not met anyone's gaze since entering. William Crouch occupied a spot directly across from Holmes, arms crossed and jaw set in stone. Foley, ever restless, had slouched in his chair, one boot tapping lightly on the stone floor. Lastly, Thomas Huggins stood near the door, hat clutched tightly in his hands, casting furtive glances between Holmes and the Crouches. Holmes remained standing. "I have gathered you all because the 13th bell," he said calmly, was no accident. It was not supernatural. It was not a mistake of rope or machinery. It was an invention, fabricated, rehearsed, and executed with theatrical precision. There was a subtle stir among the chairs. No one spoke. Holmes paced slowly before them. Believe the original plan was conceived as a trick, a staged chime, a harmless ghost story, perhaps even a message to someone specific. But somewhere along the way, it became murder. He stopped before William Crouch. You wanted to embarrass Leighton, that much is clear. His attacks on the ringing society, his whispers of impropriety, they threatened your long-held authority. I won't answer to this, Crouch growled. I've said all I— Be quiet, Holmes said, and the steel in his voice made the entire room still. You involved your niece in setting up a bell rehearsal, a dry run. She logged it, then erased it. But mistakes leave trails. Holmes turned to Anna. You knew it had gone too far, and yet you remained silent. Were you protecting your uncle or someone else? Anna's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Holmes moved next to Foley. You were the obvious suspect. Angry, publicly argumentative. But your anger lacks calculation. You were a decoy, placed near the drama, but not within it. Foley scowled. I'm tired of this. Good, Holmes cut in. Then listen carefully. He stepped back, so the entire group was in his view. Leighton's body was not found where he fell. It was moved. It was arranged. His neck was broken by a single sudden force. He did not fall. He was pushed. Now there were audible gasps. Even Pembroke shifted uncomfortably. Holmes raised a finger. Someone planned to humiliate him. But someone else used the confusion to kill him. And that someone knew the precise moment Leighton would be alone in the tower, because they helped design the distraction. He stepped toward Mrs. Leighton now, more gently. You knew Edwin had enemies, and you gave me the letters, but not all of them, did you? She tensed. Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew a slip of paper. It was a different letter, handwritten, not typed. It had been charred around the edges, but was still legible. Recovered from the grate in your parlour. A letter you burned, one in which Leighton confessed he had uncovered a secret. Not of an affair, but of old theft. Money taken from church collections, years ago. He turned back to the group. The final twist is this. The murder was not about pride or reputation. It was about silence. The room had gone utterly still. The air felt charged, as though some hidden wire had been strung between every chair and was humming beneath our feet. Holmes moved to the centre once more. William Crouch may have rung the false bell, but he did not kill Edwin Leighton. He looked directly at Anna. You did. A soft, stunned exhalation came from Mrs. Leighton. Anna sat very still. Holmes continued, voice low but relentless. You descended the stair just after your uncle. Leighton was already reeling from the scare, his footing uncertain. And when he saw you, when he reached for your arm, you pushed him. Anna's voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. He laughed. Everyone turned to her. Anna looked not at Holmes but at the floor. He saw the bell trick for what it was. He called it childish. Said he would tell the parish board everything. My uncle would lose his post. He said I was nothing more than a dull shadow of a man whose name I wore. Her voice grew stronger. He turned to leave, but I reached for him. He turned back. I only meant to hold him, to make him stop, but he slipped. Holmes said nothing. I didn't mean to kill him, she finished, but when I saw him, lying there so still, I panicked. I called for Thomas. I told him to go back up. I moved the body where it would be found. I wiped the railing with my scarf. Thomas flinched, suddenly understanding the bruise on his forearm. "You told me never to tell," he said. "You said it would ruin everything." Anna looked at him with tears in her eyes. I thought I could undo it, that if I said nothing, it would all pass. Reverend Pembroke rose slowly from his chair. "Miss Crouch," he said gently, "we must inform the authorities." William Crouch remained still, jaw tight with emotion, eyes locked on his niece, but he said nothing. Holmes stepped away, turning towards the stained-glass window behind the altar. The light through it had dimmed, clouded now by the gathering fog. I moved beside him. "You knew before this evening," I said quietly. "I suspected," Holmes replied. "The missing initials in the bell log were too neat, too careful, and guilt, when shared, leaves inconsistent impressions." Thomas wavered. William deflected. But Anna was contained. Too contained. He turned toward me. A carefully kept facade often hides a chaotic truth. That night, we returned to Baker Street by the evening train. Neither of us spoke for some time. As we approached London, I found myself gazing out over the shadowed countryside, the trees' black silhouettes against a darkening sky. "She was clever," I said at last. Holmes nodded. "And desperate. A dangerous combination." She killed in panic, but she had already lied before that. "Guilt is rarely born in a single moment," Holmes said. "It brews, it rehearses, and when the time comes, it acts." He fell silent again. At last I asked, "Do you think she'll be convicted?" She confessed, "That doesn't always mean justice." Holmes looked out the window. "No," he said softly, "but it means the performance is over." Chapter 9. A Shadow Behind the Bell Rope. The following morning found Holmes uncharacteristically restless. Though Anna Crouch's confession had neatly tied together the performance around Leighton's death, Holmes remained unsettled, pacing the sitting-room floor of Baker Street, as though some fragment of the case still eluded his grasp. "She was a pawn, Watson," he said, pausing by the window. "She acted out of panic, but she was not the architect." "You believe someone else engineered it?" Holmes nodded. "Someone whose hand remains unseen. Someone who, even now, fears discovery." He turned abruptly. "I propose we return to Chesterton-on-Wye." I blinked. "Return? But the matter is settled." Holmes's gaze was sharp. "Settled on the surface, Watson, but not below. I have learned to trust the unease that stirs when a case appears too neatly finished." An hour later, we were aboard the mid-morning train, rattling back through the sodden countryside towards the mist-wrapped village. The first hint that Holmes's instincts were correct came before we even reached the vicarage. As we approached the Green Dragon Inn, where we intended to inquire after any new village gossip, A boy came running breathlessly up the lane. "Sir, Mr. Holmes, sir." Holmes crouched swiftly. "What is it, lad?" "It's the bell tower, sir. There's smoke." Holmes straightened instantly, led the way. We followed at a sharp pace across the green, past the clutch of shops and cottages, to the churchyard. And there, rising in slow black coils from the base of the bell tower, was smoke. The heavy oak door at the tower's foot hung ajar, scorched black at the edges. Holmes pulled a handkerchief across his mouth and plunged inside. I followed, coughing as acrid smoke stung my throat. Within, the narrow stairwell was murky with soot, but the fire itself had been quickly smothered. A pile of burnt papers and fabric lay smouldering on the first landing, the very place where Leighton's body had once been found. Holmes prodded the remains carefully with his cane. "Not an accident," he muttered. "What were they burning?" He retrieved a charred fragment of parchment, inspecting it closely. Ledger pages. Records. A darker glint entered his eye. And something else. "Look here." I knelt beside him, buried beneath the scorched mess, barely surviving the flames, was a small iron key, twisted now by heat, but recognizable. "The vestry lock," Holmes said grimly. "Someone tried to destroy evidence and their means of entry." Back outside, the vicar joined us, flustered and dismayed. Holmes wasted no time. "Who holds copies of the vestry key?" "Only myself, the verger, and until recently, William Crouch." Holmes's expression hardened. "And when was the last time you saw Crouch?" Pembroke hesitated. "This morning, briefly. He said he was going to visit a cousin in Hereford. Seemed hurried." Holmes's eyes gleamed coldly. "Watson, pack quickly. We are bound for the station." Chesterton's tiny train station stood half a mile beyond the village, a lonely platform edged by dense hedgerows. When we arrived, it was nearly deserted, save for a porter moving crates toward the loading bay. Holmes approached swiftly. "Has a Mr. William Crouch boarded?" The porter scratched his head. "No, sir, but there was a gent like that. Big fellow, heavy coat. Took the footpath south toward the river half an hour ago. Said the trains were delayed." Holmes nodded once. "He's running." "Not travelling." We set off along the muddy footpath, Holmes's long stride eating the ground. The mist thickened, swallowing sound and distance alike, but Holmes moved without hesitation, scanning the hedgerows, the river's sluggish curve ahead, the drooping willows like silent sentinels. Then he stopped. There, by a fallen oak, stood William Crouch. His coat was torn. Mud spattered his boots. In his hand gleamed a thin-bladed knife, hardly the weapon of a desperate man, but dangerous nonetheless. He saw us, and for a heartbeat his face twisted with calculation. Then, without a word, he turned and fled along the riverbank. Holmes gave chase without hesitation. I followed, though the ground was treacherous, and Crouch had a head start. He plunged across the shallows, splashing wildly, slipping once and recovering. Holmes pursued with relentless precision, weaving through reeds and fallen branches. At last, near a broken footbridge, Holmes caught him. They struggled briefly, Crouch swinging the knife, Holmes dodging nimbly, before I reached them and helped wrestle the man to the ground. Holmes tore the weapon from his grasp and pinned him with an iron grip. Crouch sagged, defeated. "You'll never prove it," he spat. Holmes smiled grimly. "I already have." Back at the vicarage, with Pembroke acting as witness, Holmes laid out the truth. "You orchestrated the bell trick," he said to Crouch. "You convinced your niece and Thomas it was a harmless prank to humiliate Leighton. But you had a deeper motive." He held up the charred remains of the ledger. "You were embezzling church funds. Leighton discovered it. He confronted you. And you realized that in the chaos of a public scandal, the 13th bell mystery, you could eliminate him quietly, framing it as misadventure." Crouch's face was a mask of bitterness. "But Anna, she knew only the prank," Holmes said softly. "You exploited her loyalty." Crouch laughed harshly. "She was weak, Ishur ruined it all." Holmes's voice cut through the room. "She tried to protect you. Even after Leighton fell, she still thought she could hide the truth." He stepped closer. "But when Anna confessed publicly, your plan unraveled. And today you tried to erase the last evidence, the ledgers, the key linking you to the vestry." Holmes dropped the burnt key onto the table. "You rang the 13th bell. You moved the body. You staged the scene. And when fear was not enough to silence witnesses, you turned to fire." There was no triumph in Holmes's voice, only the quiet certainty of a mind that had traced every thread to its source. Crouch sagged, defeated. "I'll rot for it," he muttered. Holmes said nothing. Justice, after all, did not require commentary. It simply required truth. Chapter 10. A Motive. Older than murder. The evening after Crouch's arrest was a subdued one at the vicarage. The bell tower stood silent against the bruised sky, its windows empty and black. No music, no laughter, no sound save for the soft ticking of the clock on Reverend Pembroke's mantel. Holmes sat in a high-backed chair near the fire, a sheaf of documents spread across his lap. I watched him from the other side of the hearth, sipping a lukewarm cup of tea and pondering the strange, slow way this case had unfolded. It was not the swift surgical work of many of Holmes's previous triumphs. It was something more tangled, more human, and Holmes, I suspected, felt it too. He looked up from the papers. "You see, Watson," he said, "the true motive here was not greed, nor hatred, nor even panic. It was decay." I frowned. "Decay?" Holmes tapped the pages with one long finger. For decades, the church funds at St. Margaret's were siphoned off. Small sums, but regular. Hidden within flower budgets, repair ledgers, musical expenses. William Crouch knew the books better than anyone. His leadership of the bell ringers, his service to the church, it gave him both access and cover. He sat back. But the rot was not just financial. It was personal. Crouch had built an identity upon his standing here. He was the guardian of tradition, the keeper of order, the petty tyrant perhaps, but a respected one. Holmes's gaze sharpened, and Edwin Leighton threatened that. I leaned forward. "Because he found the missing funds?" Holmes nodded. "But more than that. Leighton represented change. He was educated, ambitious. He intended to modernize the parish. New choirs, a refurbished tower, broader committees that would sideline the old guard." Holmes's voice grew colder. "To men like Crouch, Watson, such change is not progress. It is annihilation. He steepled his fingers. And so, when the chance arose to both destroy Leighton and conceal his own crimes, Crouch seized it. He manipulated Anna and Thomas with the false bell ruse. He created a confusion in which murder would seem plausible, yet blameless. And when Anna confessed, I said slowly, his panic turned to desperation. Exactly. Holmes rose, tossing the papers onto the side table. Crouch tried to burn the ledgers not to erase the prank, but to erase the decades of quiet theft. The murder was merely an escalation, a symptom of a rot far older than one man's pride. Hugh turned toward the window, staring out into the darkness where the bell tower loomed. Chesterton on Wye will heal, yes, but scars remain invisible to those who do not look closely. I followed his gaze, uneasy. You believe there are other secrets. Holmes's smile was brief and humourless. There are always other secrets, Watson. In every village, every town, every human heart. The following morning, Inspector Bainbridge from Hereford arrived to take formal custody of William Crouch. Holmes provided his evidence plainly. The ledger fragments, the burnt key, the testimonies of Thomas and Anna, the timeline of events. Bainbridge, a practical man with a bushy moustache and a cautious demeanour, accepted the case with grim satisfaction. "You've saved us a scandal, Mr. Holmes," he said. "Had this lingered much longer, it would have torn the village apart." Holmes merely inclined his head. "We do not prevent scandals, Inspector. We only replace the false ones with the true." Bainbridge gave him a puzzled look, but said no more. Later that day, Holmes and I visited Anna Crouch once more before departing Chesterton. We found her in the church garden, pruning dead branches, with slow, careful movements. She looked thinner, older somehow, though no more than a few days had passed. When she saw us, she straightened and wiped her hands on her apron. "You've come to gloat, Mr. Holmes?" she asked without malice. "No," Holmes said softly. "To tell you that your part in this is over." She said nothing. Holmes studied her for a moment. "You were loyal to the wrong man. But your loyalty was not misplaced. It was simply misused." Anna's hands tightened around her shears. "I should have known," she said bitterly. "Uncle, William. He made me feel important, needed." She looked away. "I thought he loved the church. I thought I did too." Holmes's voice remained quiet. "You did, and perhaps you still can." She shook her head. "Not here, not after this." Holmes said nothing more. He understood, as I did, that some wounds did not heal within familiar walls. As we turned to go, Anna called out softly, "Mr. Holmes, we—" stopped. "Thank you," she said. Holmes inclined his head once. Without another word, we left her among the withered hedges and the broken rose stems. We departed Chesterton on Wye that afternoon, as the sun dipped behind heavy clouds, casting the village into a sepia twilight. As the train gathered speed toward London, I found myself staring out the window, watching the rolling fields blur past. Holmes sat across from me, his eyes closed, not sleeping, but thinking in that peculiar way of his, so still he might have been carved from the very wood of the carriage. At last I said, "It troubles you, this case." Holmes opened one eye. "In what way, Watson?" that the true crime was not the murder. It was the slow, creeping rot behind it. Holmes smiled faintly. Not all murders are committed with knives, Watson. Some are committed with years of silence or with carefully balanced lies. Some are as slow as a dripping tap on stone. He closed his eye again. And some, he murmured, are so familiar that we do not even call them crimes. Outside, the bells of a distant village chimed the hour. 12 chimes. No 13th, no phantom sound, only the steady tolling of truth, cutting through the fog. Chapter 11. A bell set to snare. Our return to London should have closed the book on Chesterton-on-Wye. The villain apprehended, the confession secured, the motive unearthed. By all measures, the case was complete. Yet Holmes remained restless. He sat for hours by the fireside of 21B Baker Street, his violin untouched, his pipe lying cold beside him. The stack of newspapers he usually devoured remained folded and ignored. Finally, one afternoon, as the March rain beat against the windows, he spoke. "There is one bell left unstruck, Watson." I looked up from the armchair. "You believe we missed something?" Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "I believe we have caught the blade, but not the hand that wielded it." I set aside the newspaper. "Explain." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Consider. William Crouch was careful, yes, but not ingenious. He orchestrated the 13th bell scheme clumsily. He used visible means, coercion, threat, blunt manipulation. The financial misdeeds were covered sloppily. Even the fire was an act of panic." He leaned forward. "But the staging of Leighton's body, the manipulation of perception, the setting of fear among the villagers, that was cunning. That was artful." I frowned. "You suggest another conspirator?" Holmes nodded. "Someone with a deeper understanding of fear. Someone who stood to benefit not merely from Leighton's silence, but from the collapse of Crouch himself." He stood and moved to the fireplace. "We must return to Chesterton-on-Wye." It was dark by the time we arrived once more, our carriage wheels sloshing through muddy lanes. Holmes was silent through the journey, his hands folded beneath his cloak. At the vicarage, Reverend Pembroke welcomed us with surprise and concern. "You return so soon, Mr. Holmes? There are a few final threads to tidy," Holmes said smoothly. He insisted upon one thing: a private gathering at the church that evening, under the pretence of a service of cleansing, symbolic closure for the community after their tragedy. Holmes personally arranged the seating. The verger, Mr. Alcott, was placed near the front, Mrs. Leighton slightly behind. Thomas Huggins, Anna Crouch, and the few remaining parish council members made up the small, subdued crowd. Holmes himself stood near, the belfry rope, one finger lightly resting against it. The cracked bell hung high above them, silent. And then Holmes spoke. He recounted the events of the past week, painting the narrative carefully. The 13th bell, the murder, the attempted destruction of evidence. Each point laid out with surgical precision. Then he paused, and he said in a voice just loud enough to carry, "But there is one more matter." He let the silence stretch. "We know who killed Edwin Leighton, but we do not yet know who told him to climb the tower." There was a visible ripple through the small crowd. Holmes continued. "Leighton was a proud man. He would not have gone willingly into a place prepared to humiliate him. Someone lured him there, someone he trusted or feared. He looked across the pews slowly, and that person, I believe, is among us now. I saw it then, the way Mrs. Layton stiffened, the way Mr. Alcott's fingers tightened on his cap, the way Anna Crouch bowed her head. But Holmes was not watching them. He was watching the verger. Old Mr. Alcott's face had gone pale, his mouth pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Holmes smiled faintly. "In the ledger, Mr. Alcott," he said softly, "I found entries corrected in 2 different hands, Anna's and yours, and yet you were never meant to keep the books." Alcott said nothing. Holmes stepped forward. "You knew where the handbell was hidden. You had access to the vestry, and you had reason to fear Layton's reforms." The old verger's hands trembled. Holmes's voice sharpened. "You lured Layton up the tower that night. You told him there was vandalism, or a fault in the ropework. You knew he would come." Alcott stared at him. "He would have taken everything from me," he said hoarsely. "I served this church 50 years. 50 years! And he wanted to sweep it all away." Holmes's expression softened, not with sympathy, but understanding. "You did not mean to kill him." "No," Alcott cried. "I only meant to scare him, to shame him, to make him leave. But when I saw him slip, when I heard him fall," he bowed his head. "I knew it was over. So I helped Crouch move the body. I helped him build the lie." Holmes nodded once. "You built it well." Inspector Bainbridge was summoned once again from Hereford, his moustache bristling with irritation, but his eyes sharp with curiosity. Under questioning, Alcott confessed fully. He had conspired with Crouch unknowingly, believing himself part of a harmless prank. When the prank turned fatal, he chose survival over truth. It was Alcott who had first suggested using the old cracked bell. It was Alcott who had wiped the handbell clean and returned it to the storeroom. And it was Alcott who had slipped the anonymous letters into Layton's mail months earlier, attempting to unnerve him into leaving. The decay, it seemed, ran even deeper than we had thought. As we boarded the train for London once more, I turned to Holmes. "You baited him." Holmes smiled thinly. "Only a little, Watson. Fear makes better bait than accusation." I nodded slowly. "And do you think it is over now?" Holmes considered this for a long moment. "Over," he said softly. "Perhaps." He looked out the window, where the dark fields stretched endlessly beneath the rising moon. "But fear," he added, almost to himself, "has a way of echoing, long after the bell has ceased to ring." Chapter 12. The Bell That Never Should Have Rung. The train back to London rolled through the night, its rhythmic clatter punctuating the silence in our carriage. Holmes sat opposite me, his long frame stretched out, eyes closed but mind clearly racing. I knew that look well. He was not finished. Finally, without opening his eyes, he said, "Watson, do you recall Thomas Huggins's first words to us?" Frowned, trying to summon the memory. "That he had gone back for a dropped glove," I said slowly. Holmes opened one eye. "Precisely. And where was the glove found?" "Near the first landing," I said. "Near the place where Layton's body was discovered." Holmes sat up straighter, a gleam in his gaze. "But Thomas claimed to have heard a scuff above him. a sound suggesting someone descending. Yes, I agreed. He followed it. Holmes nodded. And what did he see? Only Leighton's body. Leaned forward now. Voice taut. Consider, Watson. If Thomas heard the scuff first, then the body was already there before he reached the landing. Before the 13th bell was rung. I blinked. But the timeline? Exactly. The sequence does not align. Holmes rose from his seat and began pacing the narrow carriage. If Thomas heard a noise and found the body before the 13th chime, then the 13th bell was rung not to conceal the murder, but after it. I felt a coldness settle over me. You mean the murder was already done, and someone rang the cracked bell as a signal? Holmes smiled grimly. A signal or a warning? He tapped his temple. The 13th bell was never meant for the villagers. It was meant for one person. I leaned forward, heart racing now. Who? Holmes stopped pacing. For William Crouch. The train whistle shrieked into the night. Back at Baker Street, Holmes wasted no time. He sent a telegram to Inspector Bainbridge in Hereford, requesting that Thomas Huggins and Anna Crouch be detained temporarily for questioning, not under suspicion, but for their own protection. Then he turned to me. Watson, recall how the plan unfolded. Crouch intended a harmless prank. Alcott, too, saw it as a way to frighten Leighton. But there was another hand, one who moved unseen. I listened intently. Thomas Huggins was placed perfectly. He would discover the body. Anna Crouch was placed too. Someone close enough to mislead others, but too young to be seriously accused. Holmes's voice hardened. The prank was genuine, but the death was orchestrated by someone who knew the prank was coming. Someone who took advantage of the chaos to eliminate Leighton cleanly. I stared at him. But you said Crouch. Crouch panicked when he found the body. He moved it to the lower landing, trying to preserve the illusion of a fall. But Crouch didn't kill Leighton, neither did Anna, nor Alcott. Holmes's eyes burned. No, Watson. The true murderer was waiting in the tower before any of them arrived. I sat back stunned. But who? Who could have known about the prank beforehand? Holmes smiled grimly. That is the final thread, Watson. The one we have not pulled yet. Lifted the small, scorched piece of parchment we had rescued from the fire at the bell tower. Carefully, he held it over a candle flame, revealing a faint watermark beneath the charred surface. I peered closer. Chesterton Parish Restoration Committee, I read. Holmes's voice was soft. Leighton's reforms. He laid out a second paper, one of the unsigned letters Mrs. Leighton had given us. The typeface, the margins, the style, they matched exactly. Holmes tapped the two papers. The same person wrote the anonymous letters, forged the fake budget entries, and planned the murder. A person heavily involved with the Restoration Committee. A person who stood to gain control once Leighton was removed. I stared at him. But Mrs. Leighton? Holmes shook his head. No, Mrs. Leighton was frightened but uninvolved. She truly thought her husband was being harassed into retirement. He stood and moved to the window, staring out into the black London night. No, Watson. The architect was Reverend Julius Pembroke. The name struck the air like a gunshot. I rose to my feet. Pembroke? But he summoned us. Holmes turned, his face calm. A brilliant move. By involving me, Pembroke ensured that no suspicion would fall on him. He knew Leighton's plans would reduce the vicar's influence, control over funds, committees, the future of the church itself. By removing Leighton and framing the scandal as a tragic accident, or better yet, a supernatural event, Pembroke preserved his authority. Holmes's voice hardened, and once Crouch was arrested, Pembroke's position would be unassailable. He would stand as the village's steady hand during the storm. I shook my head slowly. And the 13th bell? A message to Crouch, Holmes said. A signal that the body was in place, that it was time to let the illusion play out. I sat heavily in the chair. And Alcott and Anna? Manipulated, used. They never saw the deeper plan. Holmes tapped the edge of the scorched parchment again. He underestimated one thing, however. What? Holmes's eyes gleamed. Me. At first light the next morning, Inspector Bainbridge descended upon Chesterton-on-Wye with 3 constables in tow. Holmes and I accompanied them to the vicarage. Pembroke answered the door himself, still robed in his morning cassock, his face composed. "Mr. Holmes," he said, smiling thinly, "I had not expected you so soon again." "Indeed, Reverend," Holmes said pleasantly, "nor I you." He handed Pembroke a folded document. "A warrant for your arrest, issued under the authority of Hereford Magistrate Court." Pembroke's smile faltered. "On what grounds?" "Forgery," Holmes said, "conspiracy and murder." Pembroke's face drained of colour. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came. And as Bainbridge's men led him away across the village green, the bells of St. Margaret's remained silent. No 13th bell, no tricks, only the hollow sound of truth, echoing at last. Chapter 13. A Flight Through. Fogg despite his arrest, Reverend Julius Pembroke did not crumble immediately under pressure. No, as Holmes anticipated, men who weave such intricate deceptions rarely yield without a final, desperate move. By late afternoon, Pembroke had been placed under temporary guard in the old stone rectory attached to the village courthouse. Bainbridge, confident in the solidity of English walls and locks, allowed himself a well-earned luncheon at the Green Dragon Inn. Holmes, however, remained wary. "Panic, Watson," he said as we stood outside the rectory wall, watching the grey sky darken into dusk, "is an unpredictable thing. Pembroke has played his hand too well, too long. He will not surrender now if there remains even a sliver of escape." I frowned, but the case against him is solid. The forgery, the letters, the fabricated budget entries. Holmes nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on the iron-barred window of Pembroke's holding room. All true, yet pride, Watson. Pride will push a man to claw through stone rather than admit defeat. He glanced at the stable-yard beyond the courthouse. "And I fear he has already begun to claw." The opportunity arose just before the village lamplighter made his rounds. As the constable assigned to Pembroke's watch stepped outside to accept a hot meal from the kindly Mrs. Broadbent, no doubt arranged by Pembroke's lingering sympathizers, a rope hidden beneath Pembroke's cassock came into play. Fashioned from strips of curtain cloth and bed-sheets, it hung now from the window ledge, barely visible against the grey stone. Holmes spotted it first. "There!" he shouted, and we broke into a run across the courtyard. Pembroke was already halfway down the makeshift rope, his polished shoes slipping dangerously against the stone. His cassock flapped around him like a broken banner. "Holmes wasted no time. Cut him off at the stables, Watson," he barked, and veered left toward the green. I sprinted after the fugitive, my boots thudding against the wet earth. Pembroke hit the ground awkwardly, stumbled, and regained his footing with surprising agility for a man of his age. He bolted toward the livery yard, where a single horse remained saddled, a delivery mount belonging to the local stationer. Pembroke seized the reins. I was almost upon him when he swung himself into the saddle with an ungainly but effective motion. "Stop!" I cried, but he merely kicked the horse into a rough canter, scattering mud and straw in his wake. Holmes reappeared beside me an instant later, his breath steady, his eyes bright. "Come, Watson, he heads for the river." We commandeered a second horse, an aging but willing creature, and gave chase. The fog deepened as we galloped toward the river banks. Pembroke's silhouette loomed ahead, blurred and ghost-like. He rode low against the horse's neck, urging it forward with frantic kicks, but he lacked a rider's natural seat. His horse faltered often, choosing its own path more than he directed it. We gained steadily. Holmes guided our mount with calm, ruthless efficiency, reading the shifting terrain by instinct more than sight. Finally, as the river curved sharply north, Pembroke made his critical mistake. He veered onto a narrow footbridge, rotted with age, slick with moss. Midway across, the horse balked, reared, and threw him. Pembroke landed hard on the wooden planks with a cry of pain, rolling sideways toward the edge. For one terrible moment, I thought he might tumble into the river. But Holmes was there in an instant, leaping from our saddle and hauling him back with a strength born of sheer will. The bridge groaned ominously beneath them. With my help, we dragged the fallen vicar to firmer ground. Pembroke lay gasping, his cassock torn, mud smeared across his face. You don't understand," he rasped. Holmes crouched beside him. "On the contrary," he said coldly, "I understand all too well." Back at the courthouse, Pembroke's second arrest was handled with less ceremony. Inspector Bainbridge, summoned hastily from his interrupted meal, shook his head with weary exasperation. "Another hour," he muttered, and he'd have vanished into the mist. Holmes only smiled faintly. Vanished, perhaps, but never free. He knelt beside Pembroke once more before the constables removed him. "There's one thing you should know, Reverend." Pembroke stared at him, hollow-eyed. Holmes's voice was quiet, almost gentle. "You never had control, not over the parish, not over Leighton, not even over your own plans." He straightened. "You were merely the last man ringing the bell, long after the cathedral had begun to crumble." Pembroke said nothing, only lowered his head in silence. That night, Holmes and I sat once more in the Green Dragon Inn, the fire crackling low, the village outside wrapped in fog and solemnity. The scandal would break soon. Chesterton on Wye would reel. Some would mourn Leighton. Others would whisper darkly about Pembroke. New leaders would rise. Old traditions would crumble. But for now, there was only quiet. Holmes leaned back in his chair, studying the ceiling beams. "Do you know, Watson," he said, "in the end, it was not Leighton's ambition that killed him, nor Crouch's greed, nor even Pembroke's pride." He closed his eyes. It was the fear of change. I said nothing, knowing he did not truly expect a response. We sat there a long while, two figures in a flickering circle of firelight, while outside, the village of Chesterton slept uneasily under the weight of its sins. And high in the silent tower of St. Margaret's, the cracked bell hung motionless, its voice stilled, its lies exposed. At last, Chapter 14, The Rope That Wasn't Pulled By. The following morning, the village of Chesterton-on-Wye was beginning to stir beneath the weight of revelation. Word had travelled swiftly. Whispers spreading down lanes, through parlour windows and into shop fronts. The vicar had fled. The vicar had killed. The vicar had lied. But the full truth had not yet reached the public. Not in the way only Holmes could articulate it, which is why, at Inspector Bainbridge's request, we stood once more within the stone walls of St. Margaret's Church, the air thick with early morning damp, and the tall shadow of the cracked bell above us. The key suspects had gathered again. Anna Crouch, pale and withdrawn, Thomas Huggins, subdued but watchful, and the ever-reliable Bainbridge with two constables nearby, now much less inclined to doubt Holmes's instinct. Holmes stood before them, not as a performer, but as a surgeon preparing to excise the final, diseased tissue from the wound. He addressed us all in his usual calm, controlled tone. "You will forgive me," he began, "for repeating what must by now seem obvious. But I find the mind often requires the full shape of a thing before it can accept the truth." He began to pace slowly beneath the belfry. "We believed at first that Edwin Leighton's death was an accident. Then, a prank gone wrong. Then, a murder committed by William Crouch to protect his thefts." He glanced toward Anna, who lowered her eyes. But the deeper truth emerged slowly. That someone else, a more cunning mind, was orchestrating events from behind the curtain. Someone who stood to lose power, not money. He paused at the altar, rail, placing his hand on the carved wood. "Reverend Pembroke." A visible shiver passed through the room. Holmes continued. Pembroke learned of Leighton's proposed reforms. Reforms that would displace him from the parish council's financial oversight. Leighton had already begun raising concerns about redundant roles and questionable use of restoration funds. He moved slowly toward the vestry door. Pembroke knew about the prank William Crouch had planned. He overheard it, or perhaps Anna, confided in him, unaware of the danger. Regardless, he saw his opportunity. He turned to us, eyes alight. He lured Leighton into the bell tower that night, under the pretense of reviewing a repair request. The pretext was plausible. Leighton was diligent and would not have refused, and the moment Leighton stepped into the stairwell, Pembroke pushed him. There was a sharp intake of breath from Anna. "Then," Holmes went on, "he arranged the body at the landing, creating the illusion of a fall. But his genius, if one dares call it that, lay in the signal." He turned now towards the bell ropes. "The 13th bell." Holmes pointed to the pulley system where the cracked bell's rope had once hung. This bell had not rung in decades, and yet it sounded clear across the village that night, but not from the belfry above. He turned to Bainbridge. I told you it had to be a handbell. And it was, hidden beneath the altar steps, connected by a concealed tripwire to the back of the pulpit, placed so that when William Crouch ascended to give his final announcements, he would unknowingly trigger the sound. Bainbridge blinked. You mean Crouch didn't ring it? Precisely. He believed he had. But he had not touched the rope. It was rigged. Pembroke had set the trap in motion hours before. Holmes moved to the pews now, pacing slowly. The false bell was not meant to frighten Leighton. He was already dead. It was meant to frighten Crouch, to implicate him, to make him question whether the prank had gone too far. He turned to Anna. And when Crouch came running down the stairs and found Leighton's body, he assumed the prank had killed him. Pembroke said nothing, perhaps even pretended to be shocked. But he knew Crouch would move the body to fit the story. Anna's voice broke into the silence. He told me Uncle had confessed to him, that I should stay silent to protect the family. Holmes's gaze softened only slightly. And you did. But Pembroke's lie unravelled the moment you told the truth. He turned now to the small iron bell, recovered from the storeroom days earlier. This handbell had residue from recent polish. Unlike the rest of the stored items, Pembroke used it the morning of the murder to test his sound timing. He never assumed we'd inspect it, and his final mistake, Holmes held up a long coil of cracked rope. This was the original rope for the cracked bell, but the end had not frayed recently. It had been cut, not torn. Someone had removed it after the prank had been exposed, to ensure no one could recreate the sound. He laid the rope on the pew beside Anna. It was found in Pembroke's study drawer, hidden beneath sermon drafts. Bainbridge nodded grimly. That seals it, then. Holmes turned to him, and his attempt to flee confirmed what I suspected. When he realized Anna had not implicated him in her confession, he grew bold. But once I returned to the village, he panicked. He clasped his hands behind his back. Guilt is a quiet voice, Inspector, but fear rings louder than any bell. Afterward, as the group dispersed, Holmes and I remained seated in the nave for a time. The stained-glass windows were beginning to catch the pale morning light. Dust motes drifted lazily in the shafts, swirling like ghosts. I broke the silence. Do you think he ever truly believed he was doing the right thing? Holmes didn't look up. Most men do, Watson. That is what makes them dangerous. A silence settled between us again. Then, very softly, Holmes added, "But the truth, once heard, cannot be unwrung." Chapter 15. The tolling of truth. The great hall of the Chesterton parish house had not been so full in years. Benches had been pushed aside. The long central aisle cleared. A dozen chairs were arranged in two facing rows, creating a narrow path, like a courtroom or stage. At the far end, seated behind a modest desk, sat Sherlock Holmes. To his left, I stood with Inspector Bainbridge, arms folded. Holmes had requested the entire sequence of the case be delivered aloud, publicly, for those who had been manipulated and misled. Not justice by courtroom, he'd said, but by clarity. And so they came. Anna, Crouch and Thomas Huggins sat near the front, pale, nervous. Mrs. Leighton was present, still in mourning black, but with a steadier gaze than I remembered. Even Mr. Briggs, the innkeeper, had crept in at the back, accompanied by half the village council. Most striking of all was the empty chair set dead centre in the circle, the place Pembroke would have occupied. Holmes rose slowly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "you have lived these past days beneath a cloud. Some have whispered of spirits. Some have clung to old secrets. Some, regrettably, have used both." His gaze swept the room. "But today we ring no bells. We toll no false warnings. Today we lay out the truth." He clasped his hands behind his back and began to pace, his voice clear, steady, and perfectly measured. On the night of the chime, Edwin Layton was murdered. Not by ghost, not by fall, but by a plan devised long before. He turned toward Anna and Thomas. Miss Crouch and Mr. Huggins believed they were part of a prank, a harmless bell to embarrass a stern choirmaster. They were manipulated by William Crouch, who feared being ousted from the bell-ringer's circle. Thirteenth looked down. Thomas remained still. But Crouch himself was being manipulated. Holmes's voice sharpened. Reverend Pembroke overheard the plan, and in that plan he saw an opportunity, not merely to eliminate Layton, but to do so without raising suspicion. He turned now to Mrs. Layton. "Your husband had begun investigating restoration funds. He confided in you that he would bring these matters to the next parish board meeting. Pembroke, fearing exposure, chose to act." Holmes resumed pacing. He lured Layton to the bell tower early, under a false pretence. A request to inspect the ropes or examine a damaged support. Once there, Pembroke ensured Layton was alone, then pushed him from the upper stair. The body landed near the first landing, badly positioned, but not immediately fatal in appearance. There was a hush in the room. Holmes stopped at the desk and retrieved a small velvet pouch. From it he withdrew the iron handbell. This, not the cracked bell above, made the infamous sound. It was rigged on a tripwire near the pulpit, timed to ring precisely when William Crouch ascended after practice. Crouch believed it was part of his own prank. He did not realize he had been used. Inspector Bainbridge stepped forward, holding up the coiled burned rope recovered from Pembroke's desk. "And when the plan began to crumble," Holmes said, "Pembroke set fire to the ledgers that would link him to the missing funds. But that fire brought more than destruction. It brought revelation." He turned to the crowd again. The scorch marks, the erased log entry marked "Test," the matching typeface on the anonymous letters, all led to one source: Pembroke's desk. A murmur ran through the crowd. Mrs. Layton closed her eyes. Holmes's voice lowered. When we confronted him, he ran, not because of the letters or even the accounts, but because of one final mistake. He held up the charred rope. The bell rope had been cut, not torn, deliberately removed, by someone who knew we might try to reconstruct the sound. Holmes paused, letting that point settle like dust on old wood. "And yet, even now," he continued, "we might ask, why go to such theatrical lengths? Why not simply poison Layton? Why not arrange a robbery?" He turned toward the villagers, his voice colder now. "Because fear was Pembroke's tool. Not blood, not bullets, but suggestion. A haunted bell. A dead man found below it. A tale of supernatural vengeance, deliberately planted to distract, confuse, and terrify. He pointed toward the tower visible through the windows behind him. That bell has not rung in 20 years, and yet you heard it, because someone made sure you would. That is the power of perception. Silence. Holmes let the weight of his words linger, then slowly he returned to his seat. "The truth, like a bell, cannot be unheard," he said, "and now it has tolled." Inspector Bainbridge stood next, delivering a brief but formal statement regarding Pembroke's full confession, which had been obtained late the night before, after his second arrest. The charges would include conspiracy, murder, document tampering, and embezzlement. Holmes did not speak again until the villagers had filed out, quieter than they had entered, as though each step out of the hall left some weight behind. When the last of them had gone, he turned to me. "It's done, Watson." I nodded slowly. "You could have humiliated him. You could have laid bare every flaw." Holmes shrugged. "Truth is humiliation enough for those who live by illusion." That evening, as the train carried us back to London, I found myself watching Holmes in profile, the window's reflection overlaying his face with the blurred countryside beyond. "Stage that final gathering like theatre," I said. Holmes gave the barest smile. "All truth is theatre, Watson. The question is only who gets to speak last." He leaned back, folding his hands behind his head. I spoke last, and the bell was silent. Outside, dusk gathered across the hills, and in Chesterton-on-Wye, the 13th bell, once a thing of fear and fiction, was now just a relic again. Chapter 16. The Sequence of Deception. We returned to Baker Street that evening, weary but alert, the scent of rain still clinging to our coats. The fog, that faithful companion of all London mysteries, curled softly at the window-panes. It was just past 8 when Holmes, having stoked the fire into a cheerful blaze, finally settled into his armchair across from me. He was silent for some time, fingers steepled beneath his chin, having long learned not to press him too soon, waited until at last he opened his eyes and spoke. "It was never about the bell, Watson." I raised an eyebrow. "Indeed?" "It was always about the performance." He leaned forward slightly, and I knew we were entering the sacred ritual. Holmes's private unravelling of the case, spoken not with pride, but with a kind of precise reverence. "From the outset," he said, "the 13th chime was designed not to clarify, but to confuse. Every detail of that evening, the practice, the timing, the cast of characters, was part of a carefully orchestrated play. And our mistake at first was assuming that the bell itself was central. It was not. It was merely the opening note." I sat straighter. "Then what was?" Holmes gestured lightly toward the fire. "Leighton's presence in the tower. That is the fulcrum. Once we ask why he went up that stairwell, alone, during a practice he rarely attended, the entire mechanism begins to turn." He ticked off points on his fingers. 1. Leighton had begun uncovering irregularities in parish expenditures, most of which traced back to Reverend Pembroke's discretionary accounts. 2. William Crouch, knowing Leighton sought to remove him from the bell ringers, devised a childish prank, a 13th bell, to embarrass him publicly. 3. Pembroke learned of the prank, perhaps from Anna Crouch, perhaps by eavesdropping. That part remains uncertain. Holmes rose and walked slowly to the window, staring out into the fog. But Pembroke, ever the tactician, recognized the opportunity. He intercepted Leighton prior to the ringing, told him there had been reports of damage in the bell mechanism, or perhaps that a parishioner had seen signs of vandalism. He turned back to me. Leighton, being diligent, went up to inspect. Holmes's tone sharpened, and Pembroke followed. He sat down again, his gaze clear and unwavering. There was a struggle, brief, perhaps even just a push. Leighton fell, striking his head. He did not die instantly, but he was unconscious. Pembroke, uncertain if the fall had killed him, dragged the body to the lower landing. But he needed more. He needed to seed the illusion. I nodded slowly. The 13th bell. Exactly. Pembroke took the handbell, already polished, already prepared, and placed it beneath the pulpit with a tripwire. When William Crouch stepped forward to announce the final hymn, he triggered the bell without knowing it. Holmes smiled faintly. And so the legend was born. A bell that hadn't rung in decades. A dead man found moments later. It played like a ghost story. And Pembroke knew that. He counted on it. But Thomas, he saw the body before the bell was heard. I interjected. Holmes nodded. A critical clue. The boy said he went back for a glove and heard someone on the stair. That sound was not Leighton. He was already lying still. It was Pembroke descending. When Thomas saw the body, he thought it had just happened. But the bell hadn't rung yet. The sound came only afterward, meaning the signal was not to Leighton, but to Crouch. I frowned. And Anna, she was a pawn, Holmes said. Pembroke told her uncle had caused the death, that speaking up would shame them both, so she kept quiet. Guilt made her pliable, but not malicious. Holmes retrieved a small notepad from the mantel and flipped through several pages. These are the financial figures from the Restoration Committee, subtly doctored, the same typeface used in the forged letters to Leighton. Pembroke had been covering small-scale embezzlement for years. Leighton's reforms threatened to shine a light on it. He looked up, so he used the bell tower to cast a longer shadow. We sat in silence a moment. Then I asked, and when Crouch was arrested, why? Did Pembroke panic? Holmes's eyes darkened. Because he had not anticipated Anna's confession. When she spoke, the narrative unravelled. Suddenly, people began asking questions about timing. The prank, once the perfect alibi, became a dangerous connection. He tried to destroy the remaining evidence by fire, and when that failed, he ran. I nodded slowly. And it was the rope, wasn't it? That final detail? Holmes smiled. Yes. When we searched Pembroke's desk and found the cut-bell rope, he had removed it after the murder to prevent any future testing. But that single act exposed his knowledge that the bell never rang by rope. Only someone deeply invested in maintaining that illusion would have tampered with it. He tossed the notepad back onto the mantel. It was not a grand conspiracy. It was a man clinging to power, using superstition to silence fact. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling. It's remarkable, Holmes. All those pieces, each insignificant, on its own, but together Holmes looked over at me. "A pattern, Watson. Always a pattern." Outside, the fog thickened against the glass, but within our sitting room, the last outlines of the case had sharpened. The bell no longer tolled, but its echo, carefully dissected and placed in order, would ring through our records for years to come. Chapter 17. Justice Rings in Silence. The wheels of justice, once set in motion, turned quickly for Reverend Julius Pembroke. Inspector Bainbridge, armed with the overwhelming evidence Holmes had assembled, presented the case before the Hereford Magistrates' Court within the week. The public hearing was attended by no fewer than half the population of Chesterton-on-Wye, their faces grave, their whispers thin as autumn wind through bare branches. Holmes and I remained in London, but news travelled swiftly. Pembroke, facing charges of embezzlement, forgery, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstructing justice, entered no plea. His silence in the courtroom was said to be chilling. A man who, having built his world upon appearances, now found himself stripped of every facade. He was remanded to await trial at the next assizes. There, it was certain he would be convicted and spend the remainder of his life in penal servitude. Some said he aged a decade in a fortnight. Some said he prayed nightly for forgiveness. Holmes, hearing this, only murmured, "A prayer, like a bell, loses its music when sounded too late." As for William Crouch, Inspector Bainbridge recommended leniency. Though guilty of deception and of encouraging the prank that precipitated the tragedy, his motives were deemed petty rather than evil. The court fined him and barred him from holding any position within the parish council or church for life. He left Chesterton quietly thereafter, vanishing into the sprawling anonymity of London. Anna Crouch and Thomas Huggins were spared formal punishment altogether. Anna, after tearfully admitting her role in the cover-up, was released under a caution and chose to leave Chesterton within days. It was whispered she sought employment in Bristol, far from the memories and shadows of St. Margaret's. Thomas, young and impressionable, remained in the village. The community, perhaps recognizing their own guilt for having ignored his unease, treated him with unusual kindness thereafter. As for Mrs. Layton, she stayed on in the vicarage for a time. It was said that she devoted herself quietly to charitable works. Her husband's name gradually restored in the village memory, not as a stern reformer, but as a man whose life had been snuffed out by fear and pride. The bells of St. Margaret's remained silent for many months. One evening, about a fortnight after the court proceedings concluded, Holmes and I sat once more in the rooms at Baker Street, a brisk fire warming the hearth. Holmes was in an unusually reflective mood. "You know, Watson," he said, swirling a glass of claret, "there is a certain poetry in the outcome." How so? The very bell Pembroke sought to manipulate, the 13th accursed note, has become his own epitaph. The villagers will not ring it again, not out of superstition, but out of memory. I nodded slowly. And Pembroke? Holmes shrugged. He fell into the same trap as so many clever men. He mistook power for invulnerability, fear for loyalty, silence for victory. He sipped his wine thoughtfully. In the end, he rang the bell only for himself. Later that week, a letter arrived from Inspector Bainbridge. I read it aloud as Holmes lounged in his chair, eyes half closed. Dear Mr. Holmes, I am pleased to inform you that the parish of Chesterton-on-Wye has elected a new vicar by unanimous vote. A Reverend Josiah Temple, a man of humble means and plain speech. It seems the village has tired of grand deceptions. As for the bells of St. Margaret's, the council has decided to commission a new set of ropes, and perhaps even repair the cracked third bell. It is a small thing, but symbolic. Your assistance in this matter has been officially commended by the magistrate and by the parish council. Enclosed is a token of their esteem, a silver bell, etched with their gratitude. With thanks, Inspector Horace Bainbridge. I turned the small package over. In my hands a simple silver desk bell, polished to a high gleam, with the words, "For truth, whose sound never fades." Holmes chuckled softly when he saw it. A fitting memento, Watson, though I dare say I shall not be ringing it very often. I placed it carefully on the mantel. The case of the 13th bell became, in time, one of Holmes's most quoted examples of psychological deduction, the way perception, superstition, and fear could be manipulated to hide a crime far more terrible than mere theft. It taught me, too, a lesson that stayed with me far beyond Chesterton-on-Wye, that murder does not always come with blood and fury. Sometimes it comes with a whisper, a tradition, a chime heard by ears already prepared to believe in ghosts. And as Holmes often said, when cases seemed particularly strange or unsettling, "When you hear a bell in the night, Watson, ask first not what rings it, but why you listen." Chapter 18. Echoes that never faded. Was a crisp April morning some weeks after the conclusion of the Chesterton-on-Wye affair, when I found Holmes in one of his rare moods of open contemplation. The window of our sitting-room at 221B Baker Street was ajar, letting in a cool breeze and the low, distant hum of a waking London. Holmes stood by the hearth, not with a case file or a newspaper in hand, but with the small silver bell, the villagers' token of gratitude, cradled loosely between his long fingers. He rang it once. The sound was clear, sharp, and pure. Nothing ghostly, nothing hidden, just a single honest note. I set down my tea and watched him. "You've thought often of Chesterton?" I said. Holmes smiled faintly. "The human mind, Watson, is curiously reluctant to surrender a puzzle, even once solved." He placed the bell carefully back upon the mantel. "It was not the murder itself that intrigued me most," he continued, "nor the financial misdeeds, nor even the manipulation of fear. I waited. It was how willingly an entire community surrendered to illusion. A cracked bell, a dead man, a whisper of superstition, and the villagers filled in the gaps themselves, turned to me, eyes sharp. Humans crave patterns, Watson, even in chaos, especially in chaos. Give them the faintest suggestion of the familiar, a haunted bell, a ghostly warning, and they will weave the tapestry themselves. I considered this, and yet it was the truth that ultimately set them free," I said. Holmes inclined his head. "Yes, but only after the illusion had already done its damage." He paused, then added almost to himself, "It is not enough to know the truth. One must choose to see it." The fire crackled softly. Outside, the bells of a nearby church began to toll the hour. Once, twice, 3 times. Holmes listened, then smiled thinly. "No 13th chime, Watson. I chuckled quietly. No phantom tolls tonight. Holmes retrieved his pipe from the mantel, tapping it lightly against the hearthstone. I sometimes wonder, he said, how many other villages, how many cities live beneath such invisible bells, tolling lies, old fears, forgotten scandals. He packed the bowl carefully. And how many never hear them at all? I sipped my tea, reflecting on the weight of his words. What you uncovered in Chesterton, I said, was more than a crime. It was a mirror. Holmes lit his pipe, the smoke rising in lazy spirals. Yes, and most men, Watson, recoil from mirrors, especially those that reflect not their faces, but their fears. He blew a single smoke ring and watched it drift toward the ceiling. Pembroke built a lie so large it could no longer be seen for what it was. And when that lie cracked, like the bell above the tower, it fell with a sound that could not be ignored. He turned toward the window, gazing out into the bustle of Baker Street. But the village will heal. They always do. New leaders, new customs. Even the cracked bell will be mended in time. I rose and joined him at the window. And you, Holmes, will you ever forget? He smiled without mirth. No, Watson. Some cases cling not because of the crime, but because of the lesson. He placed a hand lightly on my shoulder. We fancy ourselves rational creatures, but under the right bell, rung at the right moment, we become, very simply, children again, terrified of shadows. He tapped the silver bell once more. A clear note filled the room, but sometimes, he added, voice low, it is better to face the silence, to stand beneath the broken tower and hear nothing at all. I looked at him, at the strange, profound sadness behind his words, and found none of my usual responses fitting. So we stood together in silence for a long time, watching the world pass by, Baker Street bustling, London yawning into another day, while the echoes of Chesterton-on-Wye faded finally, mercifully, into memory. And somewhere deep within, I knew Holmes was right. It was not the 13th bell that haunted men. It was the silence after.